I don't like doing my own home repairs, and when I made some videos that honestly show how much I don't like it, they seem to help a lot of other guys like me. So I thought it would be good to make this new set of videos. Guys like me have a million questions for the progressive activists that we see on the news, but nobody on TV ever asks those questions. On CNN, the host probably agrees with the activists, so his questions are weak. And on Fox News, the host just tries to make them look bad. Either way, nobody's asking the questions that might actually help us get a feel for where they're coming from, so we might actually understand them a little better. It's no surprise that people who disagree over politics are so angry at each other nowadays. So right before Christmas, me and my brother, who is himself progressive, we drove around the West and did our own interviews. We drove to 22 cities and interviewed dozens of people who support progressive causes to ask those questions that are never asked. We're not trying to change their mind or make them look bad. We just want to understand where they're coming from. These folks were brave, considering what can happen nowadays if you say one wrong thing on YouTube. And we talked about a lot of really sensitive subjects, so just leave right now if these conversations might offend you. If you stay, though, I think you'll hear some things you've never heard before and have a better understanding of your fellow Americans. I did. We started in Phoenix, Arizona, where we talked to Reverend Jarrett Maupin, who's a Baptist preacher and a civil rights campaigner. You had mentioned that police shootings are complex issues. Can you explain that?
Well, they're very complex because, first let me make the case for the police officers. I think a lot of them are dead wrong in shooting people and killing people, racial profiling, or abusing people, using excessive force. But who trained them to do their job? We're sending these people into harm's way and telling them that they may not make it back to see their families at night, and we're failing to train them. So a lot of these deaths come out of not only the personal prejudice of some of these officers, but out of the ignorance of some of these officers because they've received some of the worst law enforcement training on the face of the earth. Some of these police policy training manuals around the country tell you things like if you look a black person or person of color in the eye and ask them a question, then you're making them uncomfortable. I think that makes all millennials uncomfortable. But how ridiculous is that, to be trained that you can't look at someone in the eye and ask them a serious question?
You were one of the few people I've ever seen that addresses the behavior component of the person who's shot.
I think it's very important to analyze the person who was shot. I'm not saying little, hard-headed gangbangers deserve to be killed. They don't. But still, understanding the reality of the situation. I tell people, I would much rather you be alive than dead when your family comes to me to ask for help about racial prejudice. So, respectfulness in the face of disrespect might seem like something that makes you weak or makes you subservient or makes you submissive to something. But isn't that the lesson of the civil rights movement? Isn't my nonviolence stronger than my oppressor's violence? So it's teaching the young people that not only does that give you the moral victory and the moral high ground, it can very well save your life. I believe that some of these officers are going to kill people even if they were sitting stone still, fully in compliance. But there are examples where defiance and where in that moment, attitude in that moment, served to lent itself to people being killed by exacerbating the situation. My challenge to the people in my community is, where is that defiance? Where is that attitude? Where is that action before and after these shootings? Because that's what's going to cause the policy change. Now, I don't need your attitude in the police stop. We need your attitude at the rally. We need your attitude at the march. We need your energy in a constructive way. The pain that people have, the negative socioeconomic realities of people who are trapped in our inner cities and our urban ghettos, the joblessness, the hopelessness, the despair, the decay. There's actual decay in the communities, emotionally, intellectually, physically. So when you see these killings, we've described it as a powder keg, because it really is a powder keg. And the keg's been filled with with every kind of prejudice and lack of equity that exists in society. And a lot of people in my community don't believe that white America or law enforcement in America today, which is predominantly white, recognizes that value. In places like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, all around the country, Florida, where we've seen these killings, Minnesota, you see a lack of indictments. You see a lack of arrests. You see a lack of firings. But in this city, we've had tremendous success at not just the settlements, but firing, policy changes. We've gone through 3 police chiefs in the city of Phoenix in as many years. I think body cameras are a no-brainer. I've talked to our police union here and in other cities, and the number one issue that police unions say they have with their officers is they don't want the cameras to catch them talking bad about, you know, the union president or the chief, or catching their, especially these days, a remark about a woman going by herself. That's what they say they're worried about. To me, we need those cameras because they keep the police safe and they keep the public safe. I'll be the first to tell you that 90% of the people who come to me with complaints about the police where there's been a body camera involved, you see some behavior or some action or some language that they took, which was in clear and open and unreasonable defiance to what that officer was asking them to do. A completely different story based on what you see from the camera. But then there are those instances where the camera does record, you know, excessive force or racial profiling or, you know, other acts of brutality, or just disrespect, you know, animus to the people that they're serving and supposedly protecting. So there's a lot that goes into this, and a lot of it is black accountability on black in our community. I'm not saying pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, the old kind of Uncle Tom, you know, Republican thing, oh, you don't need anything to fix yourself but yourself. I'm saying in spite of the inequities and the mistreatment of our community by the wider society and by the government, what are we going to do about ourselves? Dignity comes from here. You said charity starts at home. Dignity starts at home. Purpose starts at home. Yeah.
What's it been like for you? What's been the behavior of the press in response to what you've been doing?
I think in large part the press has been an ally in this because you know, their industry is news and information, and you know the saying, if it bleeds, it leads, and a lot of this is bloody.
We hear about cheap shots. Have you ever been subject to cheap shots?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know, in this society, and if you're black, you know, this isn't Harlem or Chicago or Jackson, Mississippi. This is Phoenix, Arizona, and you can rise too high. And every now and then you rise too high, and the press plays its part in, I think, dismantling or trying to discredit leadership. But very often they forget what they say about people, the press does. And they forget, you know, the moments where they've had absolute clarity or truth about the work that someone's doing. So I find very, very much they appear hypocritical.
You know, what I've heard, a lot of people have heard this, is if you've been to an event and then you see the press coverage of the event, it's like, wow, that's just completely two different things.
Well,
how does that happen?
They're trying to drive a narrative. You know, a lot of times they'll show up. That's why I gather them all together, talk to them all at the same time, deliver one message, because it's least likely that way for them to translate it into something else, even though it does happen. But you can be talking to the media and saying, we're coming out, we're going to be nonviolent, you know, we're here to demand that the officer's information be released who was involved in a shooting, for example. And the media will sometimes run back and say, there's going to be a riot on the streets of Phoenix tonight. These people are angry, you know.
You know, we all see what the press does. I think we see through it a lot more than they think we see.
Sure.
Why do you think they do what they do?
To compete in a highly competitive society for the public's attention. It's ratings driven. But will they admit that? I don't think so. I will admit it as an activist. Of course we do things to drive ratings. If I'm working on a case, there was a case here, a woman named Michelle Cousseau. She was killed by the police. She had a hammer in her hand. Other than that, she was unarmed. They forced their way into her home, shot her dead. The city paid you know, a considerable amount of money, into the seven figures, to settle that case with her family. Now, I had a press conference and I said, this is a bad shooting. We need justice for this woman. And it was well attended by the media, but not to the degree that we needed to drive home the issue with the city, that this case, the Cusseau case, was going to be a definitive moment, a redefining moment for this police department. So when we came back to strategize with the family, we were sitting in the funeral home planning the service, and I said to Michelle Cusseau's mother, may I borrow your daughter's body? And she looked at me like, where's he going with this? And she said, what do you mean, Rev? I said, we're going to take Michelle to our next protest. And so we made arrangements then and there with her and the funeral home director to have the casket and everything prepared. And we took that onto the streets of Phoenix. That drove the news cycle. That drove the news cycle. That was giving them not only what they wanted to cover, which is the outrageous, but also the substantive.
There's tremendous disagreement about why Caribbean immigrants, they do better economically, statistically, and they say, oh, you guys make too big a deal of race.
Well, I would say one of the strengths that Africans have, or people who come from the Caribbean, so they come over with an idea of what quality of life is. Lucky to work, lucky to socialize, lucky to join the consumer class, lucky to be able to be involved in the political process. And they are lucky. We had to go through 300 years of slavery and Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement for them to be able to enjoy that. Life for them ain't been no crystal stair. They're new to here. And I think sometimes they lose sight of that. Whereas blacks in America, we come with the attitude and the tradition of not only coming out of slavery and finding and crafting this unique kind of freedom and this unique kind of economy and this unique kind of society, but we've already paid the price to be equal participants. So someone from the Caribbean or from Africa may come over and they may think, I've got to live in a shack and I've got to save every penny and I've got to leave my family behind because I have to have stellar credit and exceptional savings to get a loan from any of these banks to start my small business. Where you have maybe a black person in this country who's saying, I've sacrificed, my family sacrificed for generations to build this country up, and yet I go into the bank and I get a loan with a different interest rate because of the color of my skin. That might be acceptable to an immigrant person. They might be willing to pay a higher cost to have a stab at the American dream.
Okay, and here's I guess my counter to that is that there's this thing, I don't know, nowadays we're hearing people talk about it as the millennial success progression.
Right.
Where, you graduate from high school, maybe get married, start having kids after you've got a job, you've gotten married, and statistically overwhelming amount of success with that. And in previous generations, we would just call it, hey, this is just part of Western civilization. Western civilization is kind of like that. Do you think the reason that guy's not getting the same interest rate is because he doesn't exhibit as many of the characteristics of Western civilization, of the millennial progression? Or is it more the color of his skin?
Well, I think when the banks, totally ripped off not only the taxpayers, but the government itself, and we passed TARP, Troubled Asset Relief, they were too big to fail, too important, too critical. Did they take less from the black taxpayer than the white taxpayer to right the ship? No, we were all equal in bailing them out, but we can't all be equal in buying in. So you see that kind of discrimination, and it has a terrible effect. The father that can't go start a small business, even though he's a war veteran or he's had perfect credit and went to high school and school, and that their children see that, and their children say, well, this system's not for me. People give up hope. So there's real discrimination that's built into this system. And I think for a lot of foreign people who come, they expect or have learned to live with it. You know, we are raised differently in America, and I think the Black American in large part will accept no less with respect to opportunity than what people have in the white community.
Don't you think there's an entrance fee for that? You know, whether it's my grandfather making sure his kids grew up without an Italian accent, or whether it's Barack Obama, you know, making sure when he went into the interview with David Brooks, he had the crease in his pants.
Sure.
It's playing the game. And the maddening thing is, some people say that's selling out.
I don't think it's selling out. I think ambition and what defines blackness is relative to the individual within the community. I admire the young man and young woman that puts on a suit or a pantsuit and goes to the interview and gets the job. You're not going to get the job, you know, wearing the finest denim in sizes 6 or 7 sizes. You're not going to get a job with me dressed like that. You're not going to get a job anywhere dressed like that. And is it right? Should people judge you based on what you're wearing? Generally, no. But, you know, I'm not going to return to a lawyer's office or to a doctor's office that looks like, you know, the staff is fresh from the set of a hip hop video. This just for just the same reason that I wouldn't go back to a doctor's office or a lawyer's office whose staff looks like they're coming from some kind of Marilyn Manson concert. You have a level of decency, a standard in the country that I think a lot of young people are struggling with, but definitely in the black community. Brandeis University 3 years ago released a study, okay, that said that the average worth of a white family in America is $100,000, right? $115,000. The average Hispanic family is $7,500. The average black family is a little more than $5,000. Now, how do I think that happened? My grandfather was a World War II veteran. And when he came back from World War II, he couldn't live north of Van Buren Street, even though he was the first black man hired by Salt River Project. So that restricted them to the kind of property they could buy. The GI Bill was also not extended to him in an equal way. So that by the time 1960 comes, 20 years later, you know, my grandfather can't use the GI Bill or pull out equity from his home in the same way that his white counterpart in society could, to start that small business or to buy something. So it's hard to get ahead because the times when we do move ahead socially and economically, there's something driving it back. And it's not the average white person. I want to say this too. The average white person in America is not a practitioner or steeped in white privilege, white power, or racism, at least not consciously. Sometimes subconsciously, insensitivities, that sort of thing, and it must be addressed, and people should be held to account. But generally, I don't think there's ever a way to make up for it completely, you know. But I think there's a way to just make things fair, to level the playing field. And when we do things like affirmative action, or hiring quotas, or put pressure on companies to balance out the demographics of their employees, people said that's not fair. That's not fair to me. I'm white and I never did anything. No, you didn't personally do anything. But you represent or come from a community that has had, you know, would you call it a fair advantage? I wouldn't call it a fair advantage.
So ends this interview in our Drive to Understand series. You know, when Reverend Maupin talked about his grandfather and then asked if white guys have a fair advantage, it was a powerful combination. I'd never really heard it put that way before. Makes you wonder why folks who do interviews for a living don't just give people the time to explain where they're coming from. You can actually learn something that way. I hope you may want to support this series by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks.